Welcome to episode 1 of my Kawasaki Z1B 900 engine repairs. In this video, I'm going to be stripping the engine down, having a look at the parts inside, see what needs to be replaced and what we can reuse, and get the crankcases ready for vapor blasting. I've had this engine for several years, but it's such a lovely day and I thought I'd take it apart in the garden rather than being cooped up in the garage. These engines are so heavy and the tyres went instantly flat as soon as I tried to lift it, so I put some air in them. With the tyres pumped up, it takes me all my effort to lift the engine so I can move it up the garden. I know this engine runs really well, but I need to clean the outside and get it vapor blasted and get the screws zinced, so I need to take it all apart. While it's all apart, I might as well check it all through and make sure it's all good and replace any bits that I need to. The engine is still bolted into its test bed from when I did its first start-up, and here's how it sounded.
It's just totally mad, aren't you?
I don't think I need to do the carbs, that's spot on.
Mate, it idles beautifully.
Yeah, I set them up with little bits of wire, and by blowing through them last night, listening to the hiss.
What are you doing now?
Well, we're going to run it without the headers to see what it sounds like in comparison. With the engine sitting nicely in the sun, I go back to the garage to get my tools to start stripping it down. You don't need very many tools to strip down a Z1 engine, just a couple of sockets, a few spanners and a screwdriver. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the cam cover, so I use my 10mm socket on my T-wrench and loosen all the securing bolts. The cam cover lifts off easily, and I'm surprised how clean it is inside. The cam lobes are virtually unmarked, and inside the cam cover is really shiny. Before I can move the central pulley, I need to set the cams in the correct position by rotating the crankshaft until the little notches on the camshafts point forward and backwards. To do this, I gently push the kickstart down until the cams are lined up just nicely. So now we can release the tension on the chain. With the 4 bolts loosened, I carefully lift up the central pulley, being careful not to drop the little rubber blocks and the little metal strips down inside the engine. I then remove the cam cover gasket and rubber end plugs. The tacho drive is held in place with a single screw, which is easily undone, but the tacho drive itself was corroded into the cylinder head and took quite a bit of a pull to get it out. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the camshafts. These are held in place with 4 bearing blocks, which are numbered 1 to 4. It feels really nice to be working outside in the garden in bright sunshine. I gradually loosen the 16 bolts evenly until the camshafts lift off the bearings. With the camshaft bearing caps removed, I carefully make sure all the retaining dowels have been removed as well, because these sometimes remain in the cylinder head. The camshafts can now be lifted out, and initial indications are they're in mint condition. They look absolutely perfect. With the second camshaft removed, I let the chain drop down the tunnel. And then I can start removing the buckets and shims. I place the buckets and shims in a little box that I've made already. It's got 8 compartments, 1 for each shim and bucket, and also for the valve springs and collets and valves to go in as well. This keeps them all separate and I can put them back in the same place. The camshafts on the Z1 engine run in removable white metal bearings, so I can now remove these from the cylinder head. The valve spring retaining caps and collets seem really nice and clean, which is amazing, especially for a 49-year-old engine. I then removed the spark plugs and the two smaller cylinder head retaining bolts, followed by the main cylinder head retaining nuts. With all the nuts loosened, I use a small magnet to retrieve them from the deep recesses in the centre. The cylinder head now lifts off easily. Part of the chain tensioner now lifts out from the cam chain tunnel. I then remove the outer part of the cam chain tensioner by loosening the two bolts. A couple of sharp taps with a hide mallet loosen the barrels. Then they can be lifted clear of the engine. But as I'm lifting them up, there's a lot of corrosion that's in the stud holes. This drops down, but it's not a problem, so I'm going to be completely stripping the engine to clean it. As part of the first start video I made 2 years ago, I jet washed the engine and gave it a really good clean. And even still, we got this corrosion and dirt and grit in the actual studs. One of the bores got a few little scratches. They feel really shallow. They may hone out. If not, I'll have to give it a rebore. I use my garage Dyson to remove all the loose grit and rust from the studs, as much as possible anyway. Some of it's dropped down inside, but that won't matter because I'll clean it out later. That's much better. Well, so far we've got a couple of bores that might need a very slight bit of attention. And also, the front cam chain guide is broken. This is common on Z1s, but you'd never know it's broken. It's running so nice and it wasn't even making a rattle, but it needs to be replaced, so I'll get a new one ordered. All the valves look quite reasonable. The pistons have a fair amount of carbon on the crown, but very little blow by the rings, which is a good sign. But I'm going to change the rings at the very least anyway, maybe a rebore of new pistons. We'll see how the bores look when I look later. So now we can get the pistons off by carefully removing the circlips. As I remove the pistons, I mark them just in case they are going to be reused. The next thing I'm going to remove is the oil distribution gallery, so I first disconnect the oil pressure switch wire. Next I'm going to remove the starter motor, so I first loosen the two bolts, then you slide it back and pull it out. I now remove the gear lever and sprocket cover. The sprocket nut's been chiselled at some time in the past, and when I bend the tab washer back it actually comes undone with my fingers. Before I progress further with the bottom end, I decided to strip the cylinder head, so first of all I'm going to remove the rubber inlet stubs. These are brand new that I fitted for the first startup a few years ago, and they're still nice and soft and supple. I'm using an old vintage valve lifter. This was in fact my dad's. We used to use it on his old Austin Cambridge years ago. And it works perfect on the Z1 engine. With the valve spring compressed, I use a small magnet to get the collets out. Then I can release the valve spring compressor and remove the valve. I'll remove the retaining plate and springs and put them in the correct place in my tin, so I can replace them back in the same place when I put the engine back together. Then I can pull the valve out and have a look at it. The seat area looks good, but there's quite a lot of carbon on the back, but this is typical and it's easy to clean off. I now repeat the process for the other 7 valves, putting them all in their respective places in my little tin. With all the valves out, the next thing I'm going to do is remove the old valve stem seals. These can be quite stubborn, but a pair of pliers soon has them removed. These are quite hard and brittle and will be replaced. I now remove the valve spring seats with a small magnet. I now need to drain the oil out of the engine so I can continue with the strip at the bottom end. The Z1 has a very large drain plug and it comes out very quickly. I start to worry the tin's going to be big enough, but it is just. That was a relief. With the oil drained, I can now continue with the strip at the bottom end, and the first thing I'm going to do is take off the points plate and points. The points and points plate look virtually brand new, with no corrosion. I now use a screwdriver handle to lock the crankshaft so I can release the nut on the end holding the points cam in place. I use an impact driver to remove the screws from the crankcases. These are really tight, and this device will not cause any damage to the actual screw heads, so they can be reused. You turn it slightly to the left with a twisting action, then hit it with a hammer, and it undoes the screw with no damage at all. Really amazing. With the screw loosened, I just use my conventional screwdriver to take the screw right out, then repeat this for all the other screws. With the cover removed, the oil seal feels a little bit soft and spongy, but I'm going to be replacing that with a new set of seals. I now repeat the process with the clutch cover. And the kickstart cover. With the kickstart cover removed, you can easily remove the spring. It unclips from a little hole and then just pulls out. This is useful to know if your kickstart spring goes, you can replace it very easily. Working on the other side of the engine, I now remove the alternator cover. I'll have a look inside, and the alternator windings look absolutely mint. I'm really pleased with that. I now need to remove the alternator rotor. This is held in place by a central bolt. I loosen the bolt, and now I have to actually pull the rotor off of the crankshaft. It's held on tight onto a taper, but what you can do is use the swing and arm spindle. It has exactly the right thread. You just screw it in, do it up, and it pops the taper off nicely. There we go. I remove the woodruff key and stick it to the rotor magnet for safekeeping. The last thing to remove before I can separate the crankcases is the selector cover. This is held on with some screws. These are also very tight, so I use my impact driver. The selector cover is a little bit difficult to get off. It seems to be that the steel dowels are corroded into the aluminium, so I prise it off gently with a screwdriver. I can now unhook the selector shaft and pull it out. I now turn the engine upside down and remove the sump. With the sump removed, you can see the gearbox, which looks fine, and the crankshaft, and also the oil pump suction filter, which has a bit of debris on it, which is to be expected. The oil filter housing looks nice and clean. And generally, it looks in nice condition. I'm really pleased about that. But we're no more when we strip it right down and check everything. So first of all, I'm going to remove the oil pump itself by loosening the 3 screws. The oil pump's tight on its location dowels, so I gently prise it off with a screwdriver. I can now loosen and remove the crankcase bolts. There's quite a lot of them. With all the crankcase bolts removed, I use one of the larger ones to screw into special jacking points on the crankcases. There's one each side at the front and one at the back. So you screw it in very gently until it just touches the mating surface. Then you put a bit of torque with the spanner, and it separates the crankcases nicely at the joint. And here you can see it lifting up. So now I can lift the bottom crankcase off the top crankcase. I can now lift the gearbox shafts and clutch out of the top crankcases. Before I can remove the crankshaft, I first need to remove the central bearing block by loosening the 4 screws. The crankshaft will now lift out of the upper crankcases, complete with the cam chain. The Z1 crankshafts are really strong and rarely need attention, and this one feels like it's in mint condition. All the bearings feel really smooth. The last thing to remove from the crankcases is the selector mechanism. 2 of them are held on a shaft, and 1 of them is on the actual drum itself. The main selector drum has a spring-loaded plunger. To remove this, you first tap the tab washer down, and using the correct socket, you can loosen it. This is actually very tight to undo. So now the selector drum will just pull out of the crankcases. I can hear Tracy calling me, so I go to investigate. It turns out we got a pigeon in the hall. He wandered in the back door, through the kitchen, then down the hall and waited by the front door. So I went round the front of the house and gently opened the front door.
That's it, that way. Go on then. Out we go. Go on then, out you go. Go on then. Now out the door.
With the pigeons safely back in the garden, I take the cylinder head into the garage for a closer inspection. To prepare the cylinder head for vapor blasting, I'm going to first remove the ore gallery plugs in the end of the cylinder heads. These are tapped in hard at the factory but can be drilled out easily and replaced. I first centre punch the centre of the bungs, then using an M6 tapping drill, which is 5mm, I drill a hole right through. With the hole drilled, I then tap the thread M6. With the thread tapped, I then screw in an M6 bolt until the head of the bolt is just flush with the side of the cylinder head. I then use my claw hammer to lever out the plug. You could also use a slide hammer to get the same effect. This plug is no good for reuse because obviously it's got a hole in the centre now, so I'll be making new ones in a future video. I can now insert a long rod into the ore gallery and tap out the plug on the other side of the engine. This plug can be reused. I now repeat this process for the remaining plugs. Using my rotary wire brush, I now clean some of the carbon off the exhaust ports because I want to examine the area around the spark plug holes and the valve guides for wear. The valve seat looks in fair condition, but I do notice that the valve guide itself looks pretty worn, and when I put in the valve, there's a massive amount of wobble. This has clearly got to be replaced. I take the cylinder head back out into the garden and put it in my barbecue and heat it up to about 150 degrees. This allows the valve guide to be tapped out with a special tool. The cylinder head just fits, and I can even shut the lid, which is just perfect. I glance up and that pigeon is up on the roof, looking down at me. After about 20 minutes, the head's ready for removal, so I carefully lift it out with my gloves on because it's really hot. I made this valve guide extraction tool years ago. It's just a piece of steel bar turned down so it slides nicely inside a valve guide to support it, and you can insert it into the valve guide and drift the old one out. They can be quite tight because you don't want them coming loose when the engine's running. Oh, that's a bit hot. Where's that bit of cloth? There we go. That's the old one out. So now I'm ready to fit the new valve guide. So I turn the head over and give it a little blow with my airline. Before I fit the new valve guide, I'll just check the diameter of the old one, and it's 11.995mm. So when I compare this with the new one, that's also 11.995mm, so we're good to go. With the new valve guide fitted, I load the crankcases barrel and cylinder head onto my ST1100 and take it over to R.D. Cox & Son in Reading for vapor blasting. thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm really excited about getting the crankcases back from the vapor blasters and the bits back from the zinc platers. So I'll see you all soon in the next video.